Hello, I'm Paul Hanford of Lost in Sound, and I'm this week's guest on MetaPod.
You're listening to MetaPod, where we unpack the web's most interesting podcasts and the stories behind them, hosted by Wendy Morrill and Kevin May.
So, Kev.
Hello.
Would you consider yourself a bit of a weird kid? Were you a weird kid at school?
So, in some sense, it's not for me to judge. It would be my classmates and friends, many of whom I think would probably say yes. But I wanted to be the weird kid at school, as in the one that was into all the music that everybody else wasn't into.
But is that weird?
In the village that I grew up, quite possibly. Okay.
Is there another city that you wish you had grown up in, maybe?
No, I had a good time where I grew up. A small village about 40 miles from London. I think in my 20s, I wish I had just tried out living in another city. You know, I lived in London for 20 years. I'd love to have lived in somewhere like New York or Berlin, funnily enough. What about you?
Why Berlin?
Why Berlin? For many reasons, just because it's a really cool city and there's lots to do and people seem quite nice and the food is terrific and I generally always have a good time when I'm there.
You always have a falafel too, right?
I always have a falafel, as we know, as regular listeners will know.
That's episode 11, folks.
Yes.
Kevin's falafel recommendation for Berlin.
It's only 2 episodes ago. Right, so what about you?
Berlin's a city I would like to live in, maybe somewhere in Japan or New Zealand, I think would be interesting as well. Not sure about a specific city, but...
3 very different types of locations there.
Yeah.
Well, this, again, always brings us quite nicely to our guest, right? So he is described, or self-described, as a bit of a weird kid, the sort of kid that didn't brush their hair. We all know how Paul feels there, right?
And Paul has said that he's the only person who's ever moved to Berlin to quit being a DJ, which is very funny.
His name is Paul Hanford, to give him his full title. Yeah. He's a Brit that's now living in Berlin.
And Paul's podcast, Lost and Sound, features stories from musicians, artists, and activists creating music and working on other cultural projects.
Yeah, I mean, the show started with a focus on Berlin, where, as we said, he now lives. But Paul has broadened Lost and Sound as the episodes have gone on to include artists from other cities across the world. That's something that started initially in Kiev in the Ukraine and now many other countries.
And what's interesting, I think, about the show, it's not limited to any specific genre of music, but instead I think he's really honing in on innovation and the role that music plays in identity and place.
I think what's also interesting about this one, very similar to episode 11 with Daniel Stern, is that yes, it's set in a particular city, but a lot of the issues and people that he talks to could be in any city around the world. It's about different kind of cultural things that are going on. So some of his guests include Ghost Poet, Ellen Alien, Laetitia Sadier from Stereolab, Thurston Moore from Sonic Youth, and of course, Daniel Miller, founder of Mute Records. Okay.
That's an interesting episode.
It's a really good episode. Anyway.
Kev, why don't you...
start the tape, huh? So thank you very much, Paul Hanford, for joining us as our guest this week on MetaPod. We're really delighted that you can join us from your home in Berlin.
Thanks so much for having me.
Okay, right. So let's just kind of dive straight in. One of your more recent episodes, you interviewed Robert Henke, the musician and one of the co-creators of Ableton Live. And your first question to him was, how did music come into your life? And I thought that would actually be a useful starting point for us to ask you. So how did music come into your life? Because you are a former DJ yourself.
The tables are turned. That's like
Yeah.
always one of the questions that I always love asking people, because I'm really interested in it and that point in people's lives where music comes in, and B, I think I've got a feeling it kind of makes people feel good talking about that, really, like quite often, for me, I think when I was growing up, it was like the early 80s. I just discovered the fact that I had enough pocket money every week to like either buy 2 cans of Dr. Pepper or 1 7-inch single from Woolworths. So I think after a while, like the idea of going to like Woolworths sort of won out. And I think it was just in the early 80s, there was such a great, I was about 7 or 8, and then there was such a great selection of pop music, really. Like I just loved things like Adam and the Ants and Duran Duran and like Boy George and Human League, and all of that kind of pop, was just so colourful. And it wasn't just like the music, it was like the way that everyone dressed and stuff like that. So it became a kind of a form of identity for me really quickly, really, just to kind of like, every Saturday buy a new Madness single or a new Wham single or something like that, really. It became, and then it sort of became that kind of thing of like sort of almost like top trumps at school, where, every kid had their band they sort of claimed as being their favourite one. And I don't think I actually managed to claim any of the bands myself. So I was kind of more secretly loving the music, because, there'd always be like the kid who would be like, I'm the Frankie Goes to Hollywood fan, and they had taken that position, so you could also be a Frankie Goes to Hollywood fan, but it was like sort of like snotty kid prison rules. And so I think that's how it came in. But it wasn't until I was like a teenager that music sort of actually became like a kind of a real way of living, or sort of life enhancing thing for me. I come from Dorset, but I was growing up in like a suburb of London, just like more in Middlesex. And it was like the late 80s, early 90s. And I was just a bit of a weird kid. I was like the sort of kid that didn't really kind of brush their hair. I didn't really have many friends. And I just remember starting sixth form college, and a bunch of kids that I sort of was friends with, but we were all a bit antagonistic with each other. Like, I think they used to kind of take the piss out of me quite a lot. Over the summer, they seemed to have chilled out, and they all started growing their hair, and they were kind of wearing those kind of like German army jackets that, like music fans used to wear. And then I remember this girl I was really attracted to had a cassette Walkman, and she played me, like, give me the headphones, and it was the Pixies. It was just a sort of a moment of thinking, like, I didn't change at all. I was still like a real, what was considered at school, a freak. But it seemed like, because a lot of the popular kids had sort of got into like indie music and 60s and 70s music and funk and rock and stuff like that, that they had all chilled out, and I wasn't the freak anymore. Like, they had become like me, and it was really good. So I think music was like it kind of thought, fuck, this is what it is. Like, I'd never heard of the Pixies before. I think it was like stuff like Stone Roses at the time as well. All of that stuff was it just sort of came to me as being like, this is brilliant. This is like what I've always been. I just didn't know it existed, really. And it kind of gave me a sense of identity and a sense of pride in not having to change for other people, really, but I could just be myself.
There's a really interesting parallel there in your answer to what Robert Henke says, because he said when he was growing up in Munich, he felt like an outlier. And then this kind of brings us almost fast forward to what you're doing now. And he moved to Berlin, where he said it was the people that attracted him there, and which he enjoyed so much because he didn't feel like the outlier. You'd step out in the morning and you'd see 50 people like me straight away. So, I mean, it's interesting. How did you think about, or what was your process about leaving London, where you were a DJ? I don't want to gloss over the intervening years.
Oh, that's all right. Yeah.
Your sixth form for 20 years up until you went to Berlin. But it's an interesting kind of parallel, as I said, with Robert. What was your thinking between giving up your? Actually, this reminds me, for those that haven't listened, there's a great line that you've said a couple of times in your podcast, which is, I think I must be the only DJ who's ever moved to Berlin to give up being a DJ or something, which I thought was which I thought was really funny. But just tell us then about the process from giving up being a DJ to going to Berlin and wanting to start the podcast that we're now talking about.
Yeah, well, I mean, I sort of started going to Berlin like almost 10 years ago, I think. I didn't really know much about the culture here. Like, I mean, I knew about like obviously very famous points in history, but like in terms of like music culture, I wasn't really like clued up to Berghain or any of the big techno stuff. I did a room swap with someone because I wanted to go away and write, and they lived in Berlin and they wanted to spend some time in London. It was just like, this is brilliant because it's like, it's going to be in the middle of the winter. It's going to be really cold. It's going to be good motivation just to be, and I don't know anyone in Berlin at all. It's some city that I don't know. I can just go and write. And then I came here and I did write a lot, but I also kind of really quickly discovered like it was an amazingly vibey musical city, really. And I did the whole kind of Berghain thing and all of that kind of stuff. And so I just kept coming back every year and I started to get to know people. And then I came out of a relationship 3 years ago. And I sort of found myself kind of without a house, really. I was just kind of sofa surfing, kind of cat sitting, plant sitting for people for a while. And I was also getting a bit frustrated with DJing in London because I was always doing kind of more like events DJing and DJing in bars and small clubs and kind of like parties rather than sort of like a Berlin style DJ playing, you know, to an amazing club. I played some great places, but, you know, it wasn't like I was playing like a set for 2 hours of, you know, uninterrupted techno or something. It was like I was going in and playing whatever to everyone. And I kind of felt that London had become so commercial in terms of my experience of DJing. When I started DJing, you know, you could, you know, in Shoreditch and East London, you could pretty much play music that you really felt, and people there would kind of get it. You know, they'd kind of trust the DJ to play it. And then by the end, I was just playing Uptown Funk to drunk city boys. and it's fair enough. Everyone's got their place, you know, in the world. But I was kind of going, what has this got to do with my love for music? You know, I'm just basically a fleshy iPod. So I went to Berlin just initially just to think about what I could do, really. And when I was there, I just kind of came up with the idea of the podcast. I just wanted to write about like different types. Originally, it was just going to be just different types of people and how they experience music and different kinds of subculture and stuff like that. Then I found out about like there was some Arts Council funding to do a project overseas from England. So I applied for that. And I was in a bar one night with some friends and they just said, well, why don't you just move here? And I had all of these reasons why I couldn't, which, you know, quite often I find were just keeping me doing something that I wasn't very happy with, really. And I just decided to move. And it's, you know, 3 months later, I came here and got the Arts Council funding, which was really good. They were announcing it a week before I left and I'd already booked everything, really. And if I hadn't have got the funding, I'd have just had to have done like some nightmarish Kickstarter or something like that. And no disrespect to anyone. I'm in awe of anyone that does a Kickstarter just because of that sheer ability to keep a campaign going. It was just something that I don't have that PR kind of ability, you know.
Wendy, mental note there. Let's not do a Kickstarter campaign at any point for MetaPod.
That was on our list for 2021, Kevin.
It's interesting. I mean, I haven't, unfortunately, had the opportunity to do that kind of nomadic, just going up routes from one city in one country to another. But, you know, Wendy here has.
That's true. Yeah, I'm based in Amsterdam, but I'm from the US, New England.
How long have you been in Amsterdam for?
13 years.
So you proper. What are people from Amsterdam called? Is it Amsterdonians or Amsterdettes?
Hamsters.
Amsterdammers.
Oh yeah, of course.
Okay.
Pretty simple, yeah.
And did you have to do a lot of uprooting yourself? Did you have to do a lot of scaling down your possessions and?
Absolutely. In fact, I just went over this story the other day. Someone asking me, how did you end up there? Well, I lived in New York City for about 8 years. A relationship was done, needed stuff to do, so I started learning about the history of Manhattan, which has a Dutch history that led me to learn Dutch language and then find Dutch friends. So, yeah, that kept me busy for a while, and I was done with New York City and moved here. Sold everything and took 2 suitcases and my beloved North American pillow. In the spirit of intercultural exploration, I think you do a bit of this in Lost in Sound. So I was just wondering if you have a personal connection. Maybe, did you learn German as a student, or are you a third culture kid, or?
No, you mean before I moved to Berlin?
Yeah.
No, it wasn't. It was really, there was nothing at all. It was, I mean, the only thing was just this vague sensation that I've always had a fascination with Central Europe, really. And I think I've always sort of felt like, I've always felt both British and European at the same time. But I've always been able to kind of sort of feel that there's, being on Britain, seeing Britain as an island is, every country has its own identities and various identities, but I always felt Europe felt quite different, even the colour of the sky to England, really, and so there was just something about that, really, that was pulling me in. And weirdly, the day before I visited, just by chance, I went round a friend's house and she put on a film that was just like her next film to watch anyway, and it was set in Berlin. It was like a typical kind of Cold War kind of film, and like I've seen it since, and I know all of the streets in that film now, but well, a lot of them. But at the time, it was just this sort of slightly scary, slightly grey, but kind of, to me, quite exciting place.
Have you had to adapt your communication or behavior in order to start the podcast in Berlin with folks that live there?
It's a really strange one in Berlin, really, because I think in terms of the podcast, not really at all, but in terms of living, and there's a sort of a process of adapting. Like Berlin is very culturally is very English language anyway, so it's more like there's more of a responsibility on the English language native speaker to kind of volunteer their interest in German culture and German language, really. And I think a lot of people, myself included, we've all made excuses for slack progress with learning the language. I do like a bit of Duolingo every day, and I mostly remember the words until I actually speak to someone, and I'm just like, and it's a slow process, but it's one I really love. But in terms of the podcast, no, it's I think the podcast just seems to exist in its own world in that way, really.
So how have you been able to recruit the legendary cast of characters that you have from Berlin in particular?
I think a lot of the time it's sort of reaching out in whatever way I can, really. And I think my personal approach is to sort of, we've got a mutual friend in common somewhere or other is always the best way. I think if you can avoid going through an artist's PR or management, then, having said that, I have and do have relations with some really good PR and management people, but there are a lot that will, they won't necessarily get your tone.
Yeah.
And I think communicating one-on-one with the artist I want to speak to always makes so much sense, because they get it, they'll get it, and then they can make an informed decision. And I often think a lot of the time I don't feel that PR and marketing people are tuned so sharply into how to convey the personal tone. It's like getting someone else to speak for you. Like, there's someone you're really attracted to at a bar, and then if you get your friend to speak to them, it's going to go terribly wrong.
It's very true. I know my friends.
Yeah.
I'm quite curious if it's always a difficult one, really. Have you had a favourite guest yet? And if so, who is it and why? If you feel that you can identify them.
You know what? Like, I'm not just saying this out of politeness or like a reluctance to sort of any kind of but I really haven't. Like every single guest gives something and shares something. There are some that afterwards I've come out feeling that was amazing. I enjoyed speaking with that person more than any other, or something like that. Then that kind of seems to change a week later. And then sometimes I've done episodes where I didn't feel the conversation was flowing very well, and then they've maybe gone down the best with people. It's just really, really, really weird. But I don't know. I mean, that's a really hard question.
Well, let me rephrase it then, if I can, Paul. Is there an interview that afterwards, and after you've done all your editing and you've had time to absorb it, that you've thought, you know what, I've really learned something either about that person or Berlin or even myself or culture as a result of it?
Well, I mean, to be honest, the whole first season, like all of the interviews were done in 2 months, back to back, really. And I didn't even know it was going to be a podcast when I was starting to do the interviews. It was like either going to be a podcast or a book. So, the whole point was me just to kind of find my way around an understanding of Berlin's musical cultural identity. So every single person I met, it was like basically they were being like a human chapter of a book. So like that, in that period of those 2 months, everyone I spoke to, it was just, there was so much information and so much, wow, I was learning, and so much people just kind of felt they could share with me, which was kind of really, really amazing.
You feature quite a lot of found sound from the cities you've been in. Is there a particular set of conditions that you think people should listen to Lost in Sound?
Oh, that's a really nice question. It's funny because I'm mixing it on my headphones, so that's kind of how I hear it. So I feel like the found sounds are kind of, on one hand, I feel their texture generally, but on the other, I think having them in stereo to me feels like they're a little extra treat for if you've got headphones on, really, as well. And I think it's very important. I like the idea that I can kind of try and capture like a real feeling of a city through doing that.
I think you do this quite well, actually. It's sort of a nice balance of a personal reflection and sort of general information to consume as a listener. So
thank you.
I appreciate that. It makes me think I'll check in with Paul today to see what he's doing in the park.
You can hear the bells of midday going behind me here. I'm in Berlin, in Kreuzberg, along the canal. There's lots of swans about. I think they've seen my little fluffy thing on the top of my recorder and they think it's bread. But maybe that's an unfair assumption of swans' intellect. Maybe they know it is a digital recorder.
Thanks very much. That's actually like one of the bits I enjoyed the most as well, actually. But I think because of like COVID as well and stuff, it kind of was a little bit of a problem for a while, because when I wanted to start making this current season, it was when the original lockdown was on. I have to confess, I was one of these people that was very, very fearful at the time, and I was very, very sort of limited and socially limiting myself. And I was very so much hand sanitizing everything constantly. And so I was really kind of thinking, oh my God, like I really want to record on a train, but there's no way I want to get on a train. And how am I going to get these sounds from, really? And I think now it's, and in the summer, everything kind of opened up again to a degree. And I started to feel a lot more comfortable. And now we've kind of gone back inwards. But I think we all, or at least I know the score now of what's going on. So there's more of a sense of self-protection and understanding how to kind of get about every day in whatever and how I feel comfortable with. So for a while, it was like a big situation of like, there's so many things I actually want to do when this whole mess is over in terms of sound recording that I just don't want to do right now, really. So I'd say like the June episodes from next year are going to be sonically incredible.
Okay. Something to look forward to.
Yeah.
Talking related to the sonics of the podcast, you do seem to drink an extraordinary amount of coffee. You always say, I'm just walking into this cafe for a coffee before I go and meet. It's a nice touch. It brings out the human aspects, but not related.
Except for the episode where you've had 2 glasses of red wine.
Oh yeah. That's evening time, daytime coffee, evening time.
Very good.
that makes a lot of sense. So, not related to wine, coffee, or sounds of the subway or anything, but I honestly did listen to other episodes other than the Robert Henke one, but I just thought there was something in that interview, and I this was the last one I listened to, which is why it's a bit more fresh, I suppose. That was recorded in April 2019, I think you said, and it was only published very recently.
Yeah.
But it was so pertinent because you have a discussion in that particular episode where you're talking about how virtual is replacing the actual when it comes to, and I've written it down here, creative collaboration. And, little did you know that over the course of what happened this year, so much of whether it's creativity or business or life or catching up with family has become a virtual endeavor. And I just wonder, given what you spoke to Robert about in April 2019 and how that was all unraveling from a creative perspective, what are your kind of thoughts on that now that we're recording this in December 2020? Couple of lockdowns between us all, it's been a crazy year. So
I mean, it's you mean in terms of the virtual realms that we have and how they're developing generally?
I mean it in the sense of we are forced to be creative in a virtual environment now, rather than all, if you take a band, jamming in a room together, we now have to jam over Zoom, for example.
I mean, it's kind of crazy that this pandemic has happened at the point in history where there's the technology to be able to do that, really. Like, even 10 years ago, we would have been struggling with that a lot. And I don't know whether that would have made culture or creativity. I think culture and creativity always finds its way, in whatever, it's impossible not to. It's a human part of the human condition, really, to want to express ourselves. The fact that we do have this kind of connectedness now, digitally, virtually, it's so interesting that exactly 100 years between this pandemic and the last one, that we've got this now to kind of get us through. But I think at the same time, it does, the overdrive of digitalness does have, we don't know what the effects of it are yet, honest. I know that I've definitely, this second lockdown, started to feel very sort of like cyborg-like in a way, I guess. I feel like I think I've actually had dreams about being on Instagram. I've gone to sleep and dreamt about Instagram notifications and stuff like that. And I think this sort of like idea, and then when I leave the house in the morning, because I still go out and get my morning coffee, and I have to kind of, I've noticed my eyes adjusting more to the streets than and the sky and the dimensions of the street than I would do if it was like normal time, really. So I feel it's as much at the same time that it's amazing that like, even if people can't be together and bands can't play together, they can kind of play, they can find ways to kind of connect digitally. I feel in terms of human interaction, I think we're just all really, really, really missing it, aren't we, really? Like, I'm getting to the point now where, like, because there's this vaccine now, and because there's this possibility that if that all works and all goes ahead, then there might be normal life might be able to resume as the year goes on. I'm starting to kind of have like an imaginary wish list of things that I just want to crack on and do with other people and in having experiences. And I think top of those, going back to the Robert Henke thing, is that I don't think I went clubbing as much as I thought I would do before I moved to Berlin. Like I'm too old to kind of like get lost in a dark room every weekend in Berghain, but I kind of imagined that maybe once a month I would, but I think I only went about 5 or 6 times clubbing in 2 years. And considering it's such a kind of cultural force there, I definitely feel like that way of just interacting with people is just going to be so good. And then hopefully we'll all forget to be online for a while, really.
Just a quick follow-up from me, I suppose. It would be interesting, given what you just said about people coping or not coping and the differences, to go back and re-interview some of your earlier guests. And I'm thinking in particular, your interviewee who ran the Centre for Syrian Refugees, and they were making music in a studio, just to kind of get a sense of how they, not only for some of them still a new city, some of them maybe a bit of an older city for them, but they've also gone through a lockdown period.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely, I have close ties with some of the people from that project. There's going to be a time when that'll be really right to kind of pick up on that for me, I think. And
Yeah.
but it is just really, really interesting seeing people's progresses, and a lot of people that I've interviewed and I've kept in contact with. So yeah, it does feel, I don't feel like I'm quite on the sort of second rounds kind of phase yet.
I think to continue the virtual and in real life conversation here, and to stick with Robert Henke, he and many of your other interviewees, they talk about creativity and innovation in a variety of ways, but he's speaking about the pre-internet era and this sort of powerful just ability to do what you want when you don't know that someone else has already done it. You're not worried about it. How do you do that? I mean, like I said, you're in this legendary city with a legendary cast of characters in your first season. How have you avoided, the well-worn narratives about Berlin and these characters?
That's really nice of you to say. Thank you, because I didn't realise I hadn't done that, to be honest.
Well, you have.
Thank you. I think, one thing I do know is that what is really important to me about how music is discussed is to really emphasise that it's people that are making music, and people come from somewhere, and people have had mums and dads and have elements that come into their lives that have made music and that have kind of inspired them on their journeys. And, I couldn't give a fuck about how someone's learned to play an instrument, or like what studio made this sound and stuff like that. And I think I was driven to kind of create something from the beginning when it could have been a book that was showing that the real musical education and the real notation, technical excellence of how music is made comes from people's surroundings, and the technical, musical, classic skills that they've picked up are skills that you can kind of learn and study. And that's just my opinion, but I just wanted to just kind of create a very human portrait, really. And I think by just chatting with people, I felt I didn't really need to ask too many biographical questions. Like, a lot of the time that just kind of comes out anyway, and I'm really interested in, I'm getting a little bit contradictory here, because I'm saying, like, I don't want to know about someone's biography, but I also realize how important their background is. But I think it's just, I didn't want to impose a biography on people. I wanted to just feel that people can talk in whatever way they'd like to talk. And so I think in that way, whatever kind of portrait of Berlin came out of that came from just what people have to say, rather than me trying to go, I need to have a bit here about the wall coming down and the punks that were there. If that comes up, really.
Was that different when you went to Kiev to speak with people? Was there a different feeling in talking with people there?
That was really interesting, because that was done in 2 weekends. Like, I went for one weekend and kind of just did some research and started to make some contacts. And then I came back a month later, and with the interviews all kind of, picked. And in a lot of ways, it was really, really similar. Like, I was just guided by what people say. I think even more so, really, because I knew less. And in a short space of time, there was more stuff that had happened recently that was kind of politically charged. And a lot of the culture that people that I spoke to were riding on or doing stuff with was so fresh, like kind of come out of the last five or 6 years, really, of Kiev's history. I think it was more condensed, really. And again, it was just the same thing of going in kind of blind. I didn't really realize that the Lost and Sound was that until quite recently, actually.
I found those episodes, I haven't listened to all of them yet, but quite interesting because, well, they're a little bit shorter for one. It sort of leaves you thinking like, I should know a little bit more about what's going on here. And so I just think it's a nice invitation for people to do that.
Thanks. I mean, the plan was to do this year to go to another city and do a similar thing then, but that will, in the future, that was something I definitely want to do again, and quite regularly, is to visit places and let people, hopefully people will want to show me around and talk to me about their music.
Which cities are on your wish list?
Oh my gosh, it kind of changes all the time. I think I'd love to do Moscow. I don't know why Moscow, but I would love to, and I don't really know too much about it. I'm kind of like, it might sound a bit counterproductive as well, but I like the idea of not knowing too much before and just doing enough research to find interesting musicians, and then that way I think there's a sort of innocence that comes through.
Can you talk about the artwork for the podcast? I noticed that it sort of references the tile work that you see in much of Berlin's underground system.
Yeah, it is.
Is that right?
You are absolutely correct. It's Constanzastrasse, and it's on the U7, the beginning of Charlottenburg. Yeah, I was just getting the train one day, and it was a couple of days before the first episode came out, and I didn't have any artwork. To any of your listeners that have not been to the Berlin U-Bahn, all of the stations have got their own little kind of artistic design on the platforms, and particularly when you go into West Berlin, they get very, very fruity. Like they're very like, look like sort of amazing 20th century classic designs, really. That one was just great. I just loved it. It just seemed to fit, and it just looks good on a thumbnail.
Okay. Yeah, I like the tile work in the system there too.
Is it going back to Berlin and that first season of the podcast, and this could apply to other cities? Do you sense it's quite easy to romanticize a city like Berlin because of Bowie, because of Hansa, because of the war, from a music perspective and the culture that surrounds it? And actually, the reality is, once you're there and you're under the skin of the place, as you have been for 3 years now, Paul. I mean, is the reality often different?
I mean, it's very, 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 very easy to romanticize a city like Berlin, definitely. And I think a lot of people, myself included, partly came here because of the romance, really, and the reality can be quite different. I think we all have stories of people we know here that have kind of fallen between the cracks, that have kind of come here with artistic ambitions or kind of, maybe not even artistic, maybe more like free-spirited ambitions. There's quite a sad, quite depressing element to that as well. And on a slightly more kind of day-to-day pattern, there's this sort of weird contrast here between the kind of image of it being a very free-spirited city, with the clubs, with like naked swimming and all of these kinds of things, being able to smoke in bars and just the general kind of wear whatever you like walking down the streetness, and the sort of like and the kind of bureaucracy as well. Anyone that's kind of tried to live here or lived here, you have to go through quite a few hoops in terms of like registering and getting a house. You can't. It's not a straightforward process, which is kind of weirdly contrasting to London, which I found doesn't have the kind of bohemian freedoms. But in terms of money, if you've got money, they just don't care what you do. It's a weird flip, really. So yeah, there is a sort of a downside, and I think I've definitely had to kind of balance my romantic view of Berlin with being able to kind of afford to live here, really.
I think, and related to that, as one of the episodes in that first run, you were talking to your guest about gentrification and how, and I thought that was fascinating, mostly because I lived in London as well for 20 years. I don't do anymore. And the last part of London I lived in was Walthamstow.
Right, yeah.
And just at the point that I moved out of Walthamstow was when it went through its gentrification period, and it was called Awesomestow and all these terrible names and things like that. And, they wanted to gentrify Walthamstow.
Yeah.
It kind of lost, some argue, some of its East End charm, for want of coming up with a cliche, but for the sake of progress. And I just think, just generally, not specifically about Berlin, I mean, how do you kind of think about that? Because you're one of the people that's moved to Berlin in recent years, as you said, because you were slightly romanticized by the place and stuff like that. And are we sometimes part of the problem almost?
Yeah, it is weird, isn't it? It's like I'm kind of aware that I am part of the gentrification process. Like it's like a kind of a spectrum or something, isn't it? Or like a kind of a timeline. And I'm not really entirely sure where on that sort of scale of things I am. Like I think I probably still qualify in the kind of artist bracket. But then at the same time, there's so many. I don't know. It's such a multi-leveled kind of thing, isn't it? Like we're all at some point in gentrification where we can see what's ahead and we're like, no, that can't happen here, you know. But I think it's important to be aware of what point we've stepped into a picture, or I've stepped into a picture like that, and maybe what has had to stop happening for someone like me, you know, in my situation to be here. So I don't know. It's like, it's definitely like, I guess it's about being informed or trying to inform myself. And I think that guest you referred to as well was another case in point of like, I didn't know that until she was talking about it. Really.
Yeah, exactly. It's almost like some cities want to find there's that delicate balance between being cool and creative and arty, and gentrification in the name of progress and bringing new money and investment into a city. And I wonder, you know, I've never lived in Berlin. I've visited many times. I wonder whether you would say that it's at the moment has managed to strike that balance between the two, or is it tipping perhaps too much towards the gentrification? Certainly your guests seem to think so in that particular episode.
Yeah, it's really hard to say. I mean, again, like this year, it's really hard to know anything this year. But up until now, the sense that I was kind of getting was that there were certain, I think I'd been here long enough to notice, even within, like, I've been here for 3 years now, but say there was 2 years of just normal life beforehand, I was starting to notice things changing in that amount of time as well. Like, you'd suddenly, like about a year and a half ago, there were e-scooters everywhere, you know, and not just that, but like people would be leaving e-scooters just on the street. People would be like sort of on a Sunday, sort of drunk day scootering around on e-scooters and then throwing them in the canals and stuff. And then I heard stories about, to get the e-scooters mended, they had to be shipped over to some other part of the world where the actual cost of the shipping is so bad for the environment and all of this and So I was kind of noticing things. It feels like in other ways there's a sort of sense of inbuilt culture here of understanding of what people should keep alive. So even though gentrification is happening, it's not going to happen without a fight.
Yeah, interesting. There's a saying, maybe you've heard of it. I've got to look at my notes here because Samuel Johnson was a writer in the 18th century, and he said, when you're tired of London, then you're tired of life. This is a fairly well-known phrase. Is that...
He wasn't living there in 2012, was he?
Well, is that something that you think will come to you in your time in Berlin, that you'll just be tired of it and want to go back to London at some point, or is it roots that you've found and very happy with now?
I wouldn't really know that. Yeah. I didn't imagine. I mean, I love London still, but I joke about it like it's the ex-wife. No, it's like I have a love-hate relationship with a lot of things, really, you know, and so I don't know, you know, I'm planning to stay here, but you never know, do you? We all know people that are just so committed to something that then they're just over it.
Talking of love and hate, you are the first guest that we've interviewed that has referenced Marmite in their podcast.
Yeah.
Love it or hate it. So we might end up editing this bit out, but we did want to congratulate
you. No, that's all right. That's
for
okay.
being our first guest to talk about Marmite. So anyway, well done.
Yeah, no, and there is like this English shop that is just maybe 10 minutes walk from my apartment, and it's just got every English product you would want. It sounds terrible, but like all of the Brits, we all go there. It looks a bit like a National Trust shop, you know, like when you go to a National Trust castle and they've got like the kind of the tea towels of the castle on it and stuff like that. It looks a bit like that, but it's just full of the most wonderful. It's got like racks of Marmite, racks of Branston's pickles, whole freezers full of like Yorkshire puddings and stuff.
Can you send me this address later?
I will totally do that. I will totally do that. And it's just a dream. It's like everything is obviously a slightly premium price, but
what about Bendix mints?
Yes, they have Benedict's mints. They have Bertie Bassett's. They have Curly Whirlies. They have everything. It's called Broken English, in case anyone's listening in Berlin that doesn't know about it, is from England or likes English stuff and is missing PG tips. But yeah, it is amazing.
Is there anything that hasn't worked for you over the course of the Lost in Sound project thus far, where you've thought, I'm going to approach it in a different way? And can you tell us about a creative process change that maybe you've had since living in Berlin?
Well, I guess, like, you've listened to quite a lot of episodes, and so you've sort of seen the tone change over it, and it's gone from being more soundscapey at the beginning to more of an interview-based thing now, and that might change again. But there's been nothing that has gone really wrong, because there's been a lot of things that haven't worked initially, but I've kind of worked through them, if that makes sense. So like, the first episode took about 3 weeks to put together, because I just didn't know what I was doing. And like, I'd speak into the microphone to record my voiceover. I'd go, God, I sound terrible. And then I'd go like, why are the words so bad? And things like that. And then, why is this not cutting with this? Everything like that was stuff that I knew I had to get it working right, but it didn't work initially, So it was just a question of trial and error till everything fitted into place, really.
It sounds strangely familiar, doesn't it, Wendy?
I wasn't going to say it, but thanks for mentioning it, Kevin.
Yeah, it's just try and try again until things slot in, isn't it?
That's right. So has your voice become lower or deeper since starting podcasting?
It went lower initially. Now it's
Did it really?
Going a little bit.
Now it's higher?
Now it's going a little bit normal again.
Normal.
Well, normal. I don't know what normal is, but I don't know if you've found this at all. Like, you both sound very natural to me, but when I started doing the voiceover bits for the first episode, I definitely...
You haven't heard our podcast yet?
Right, okay.
The intro is just going to blow you away.
Amazing.
It's only taken us 2 months to sort it out.
Can't wait to hear it. It just takes a while to get used to how your voice comes across when you record it, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's true.
So you're approaching normal again?
I'm approaching normal. I'm leveling out. Yeah.
Okay.
It's like a wavy ometer thing, kind of swinging backwards and forwards, and now it's kind of, it's like, it's got a little bit of the radio-ness, and it's got a little bit of like how I sound when I'm just chatting to someone-ness.
So the last question, I suppose, is what are you listening to, whether that's podcasts or music or, I don't know, something else?
Oh, good question. Podcast-wise, in the daytime, I mostly have NTS radio on.
Okay.
Really. In terms of podcasts, I think my go-tos, I've got 3 that I make sure I listen to every week, and that's Mark Maron, Adam Buxton, and Galdem. Yeah, that just feels very comforting to me for some reason. It's just like, I think something about some people who do podcasts is just like, they're your friends, they just come over and they're having a bit of a chat.
Yeah. And are there any, this probably sounds weird, but innovations or, are there any methods of storytelling or production or presentation that you think are interesting or cutting? I'd hate to use the word cutting edge, but what do you think is next for podcasting? Any ideas? Yeah,
that's really interesting, really. Like, I still don't feel like I've nailed a certain idea of something that I want to do, which is a lot more soundscapey, a lot more like sort of cinematic in a way.
Okay.
But then at the same time, there's a whole world of podcasts that I just don't know about, really. So someone might be doing that already. It's going to be interesting when things open up again, because I think there might be an interesting way to kind of combine more of a live experience with a podcasting experience as well, and maybe more of like a kind of installation space elements to it. Because I think we've had a year of being inside and absorbing these virtual things, and podcasts are such a big part of that. When we're given freedom of movement and space again, it's going to be interesting to see how we take that into the desire to be outside and the desire to connect with people in real life more. So I think the innovations for me are going to come next when we de-cyborg ourselves.
Okay.
I like that phrase.
Well, Paul Hanford of Lost in Sound, thank you very much for talking to us here at MetaPod.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me on. Thank you.
So thanks to Paul for talking to us, and again, congratulations on being the first MetaPod guest to reference Marmite in their podcast. This is definitely something to celebrate, Kev.
Now, we could do a spin-off of MetaPod, Meta Marmite or something, just where we talk about Marmite for episode after episode, because I kind of like Marmite.
Have you had the new chili? I guess it's called Dynamite. Sorry.
It's called Dynamite. It's very nice. And there's also the mature Marmite called XO, which is slightly stronger, infinitely nicer, in my opinion.
I really like that one. It's just that it makes your lid get stuck in the jar.
Right. Anyway, back to Paul. So, thanks ever so much to Paul.
Congratulations, Paul.
Thanks for the local tip, of course, on where to find British products in Berlin, such as Marmite. A shop called Broken English, and we'll check that out on our next visits to the city.
And the lineup of guests on Lost in Sound continues to be pretty impressive. There's a great selection of artists you might know and some you might not. So good selection to choose from there. Check that out. Another thing to mention is that Paul has a special series coming soon. It's called Seeing Sound, and that's in collaboration with Playtronica. The series examines moments where music and images have combined, and that's coming in April.
Okay, as always, you can follow Paul and the Lost in Sound podcast on Instagram and Facebook. Links to those are on the MetaPod page for this episode.
They are. And next week, we go back to True Crime in a talk with Dan Maudsley of the BBC podcast Paradise.
Which is
a rather chilling story of two young British backpackers who go missing in Central America in 1978.
Yeah, we probably shouldn't sound so excited about it because it's a really grim story, but it is an absolutely terrific podcast. And we spoke to Dan a couple of months ago now, wasn't it? I think.
Yes.
The turn of the year, we finally got hold of him to talk to us. So you can find out about the other podcasts that are coming up in future episodes at metapodshow.com. We've lined up several new guests for you, including Marissa Bridge of The Apology Line and Danny Robbins. This is one of your current faves, isn't it? So, which Danny Robbins of the Battersea Poltergeist.
So, let us know if you have suggestions on new guests. You can contact us at our website or on any of our social media channels.
Okay, that's it. So, Dan Maudsley of Paradise next week. That's all from us for now.
And we'll see you next time.
We will.
That's it for MetaPod this time. Thanks for listening. MetaPod will be back soon with another unpacking of the web's most interesting podcasts. But in the meantime, make sure to subscribe at any of the usual places you find your other favourite podcasts. We'd hate for you to miss upcoming episodes, and we'd love it if you left us a review. You can let us know what you think of this episode by going to metapodshow.com. We'll see you next time. MetaPod is produced by Wendy Morrill and Kevin May.